And I'm delighted to see that your visitor numbers, both domestic and overseas, are rising in the wake of some terrible decision-making over COVID, which affected everybody in the country. So that's good news. I should disclose that my brother is responsible through his Madrid company in making the Diplodocus that sits outside the Natural History Museum, a business called Factomate. Yeah. So he did that using digital technology. The focus of my questions is on the set of new priorities which you introduced in July 24, which were growth and good jobs in every place, richer lives with choices and opportunities for all, a more socially cohesive country with an inclusive national story. So I was interested, who did that come from the DCMS or did that come from the Minister? $1 million to these 15 institutions, or he did in 24/5. I think I'm right in saying January 26, unless you tell me differently, you hadn't clarified how you intend to assess whether the museums and galleries are delivering against those three priorities. So has that been clarified yet?
And that is the basis on which we've been giving them the money. These objectives, the priority outcomes, we've been putting into the chairman's letters. So each year, alongside all the things we've already talked about, we also write to each chairman or chairwoman to set out a whole series of common factors, including these sorts of things, but also some particular things for each institution. And so we have been telling them about that, and then we are doing our own work across the whole of DCMS on how we're going to measure these priority outcomes, because as you can see, they're quite general. And so, for example, on jobs, of course, it was great to see the recent press on V&A East and what that has done for the Stratford area, and it may well be in some places that these institutions do drive direct growth, but we want to make sure that we ask them some specific things so that we can measure.
Are they clear on what they need to do? Because presumably you will skew your grant funding to those who actually deliver on your objectives. I mean, you are, after all, the master, and they are ultimately receiving gifts. So is it clear to them? From your answer, I'm not sure it is entirely clear to them.
They know about these priorities, but we haven't said to them, therefore you need to do this number of jobs over this time period, or this is the definition of social cohesion. So that we're going to come back to all of our arm's length bodies, and it's part of the wider work DCMS is doing on its outcomes.
Just to look at them, I mean, growth and good jobs in every place, well, that's verbal baby food. Richer lives with choices and opportunities for all. I mean, what does that mean? Does that mean you're going to hire people on merit or through ability? I mean, I'm not clear. I'm of adequate intelligence. I'm not very clever, but that's not entirely clear to me, so I don't see how it would be clear to them. And then you look at a more socially cohesive country with an inclusive national story. Now, our history is our history. Geology is geology. So how does somebody like the Natural History Museum, for instance, change itself to deliver on an inclusive national story? And aren't people coming to Britain because they want to see our history, they want to see our culture, and particularly those foreign visitors who are coming here, do they want to see that interfered with, and could that not possibly damage the visitor numbers if you start messing around with that too much?
There's quite a lot in that. Is it okay if I just break down some of the things?
Well, I couldn't help asking because I think it's quite important.
I know, understood, of course. So at this point in their framework agreements, they are delivering against their objectives of caring for the collection and ensuring those collections are accessible on a free basis, because that's the policy decision. We also measure these specific KPIs that are set out in figure 11 that have been in place for a long time, and we're updating those as we've discussed, and we will publish those once updated later on this year. In terms of the priority outcomes that are set out on page 36, those are higher levels. So for all of DCMS,
what you just saw in this exchange wasn't a normal line of questioning about museum funding or bureaucratic oversight. It was something far more fundamental. It was a direct interrogation of how modern governments now justify decisions when the language they use becomes increasingly broad, abstract, and difficult to measure in any concrete way. Because Rupert Lowe didn't start by attacking the funding itself. He started by attacking the framework of thinking behind it. Phrases like growth in every place, richer lives with choices and opportunities for all, and a more socially cohesive country with an inclusive national story were not treated as harmless policy slogans. They were treated as the core problem. And once you strip away the political tone and look at them closely, the criticism begins to make sense in a very uncomfortable way. These phrases are intentionally expansive. They are designed to sound positive, progressive, and inclusive, but they are also deliberately non-specific. And that lack of specificity becomes the central issue the moment someone asks a simple question: how do you measure any of this in practice? Because once funding is tied to outcomes, and those outcomes are defined in language that has no fixed operational meaning, you immediately introduce a gray zone where interpretation replaces accountability. One department may interpret social cohesion one way, another institution may interpret it differently, and a third may have no clear guidance at all. And yet, all of them are still expected to perform against it. That is exactly the pressure point Lowe was exposing. Not necessarily the intention behind the policy, but the mechanics of how that intention is translated into real-world enforcement. And the uncomfortable truth revealed in the exchange is that those mechanics are still incomplete. The official response repeatedly circles back to the same position. These are high-level objectives, and the department is working on metrics. That phrase sounds administrative, even reasonable on the surface. But in the context of funding allocations, hundreds of millions of pounds distributed across major national institutions, it raises a much more serious question. Why are the metrics being developed after the priorities have already been announced and embedded into governance structures? This creates a structural mismatch. Institutions are being told what the goals are, but not how success will be evaluated. They are being asked to align with outcomes that are still, by admission, undefined at the measurement level. And in any system that involves public money, that gap is not just technical. It becomes political, ethical, and ultimately controversial. Lowe's line of questioning deliberately pushes into that gap. When he challenges what an inclusive national story actually means in practice, he is not just asking for clarification. He is pointing out that history, culture, and national identity are not variables that can be easily re-engineered through administrative instruction. Museums, especially national ones, exist precisely because they preserve continuity, not because they continuously redefine it according to shifting political language. And that is where the deeper tension emerges. Because the response suggests that these institutions are expected to both preserve historical integrity and simultaneously reflect evolving political priorities around inclusion and cohesion. Those two objectives are not necessarily incompatible, but they are also not naturally aligned without careful definition. And that definition is exactly what is missing in the exchange. Instead of resolving that tension, the discussion moves toward reassurance. The department explains that museums still focus on collections, accessibility, and established KPIs. It also emphasizes that more detailed metrics will be published later. But again, that reinforces the same underlying issue. Oversight is being constructed retroactively, not preemptively. From a governance perspective, that sequencing matters, because once funding flows and expectations are communicated, institutions begin to adapt their internal priorities accordingly. If the evaluation criteria are not fully defined at that point, then adaptation happens in the dark, based on assumptions, interpretations, and partial guidance rather than clear benchmarks. And that is where Lowe's criticism lands most forcefully. He is essentially arguing that you cannot reasonably expect accountability from institutions if accountability itself is still being defined after the fact. And while the response attempts to soften that by pointing to ongoing work and future publication of metrics, it does not fully resolve the core concern. The conversation then widens into something even more politically sensitive: the distribution of cultural funding across the country. Here, the issue shifts from abstract definitions to geographic and institutional imbalance. The explanation provided shows a layered system: national museums, regional museums, Arts Council funding, local authority support, tax reliefs, all operating simultaneously. On paper, this looks like a comprehensive ecosystem, but even here, the underlying question remains the same. How are priorities actually decided when the system is so fragmented across multiple funding channels and policy instruments? The response highlights percentages, funding buckets, and strategic reviews, which demonstrate effort and structure. But it also acknowledges something implicitly important. The system is large, complex, and still evolving in how it connects strategic intent to measurable delivery. That complexity matters because it reinforces why the original concern exists in the first place. When systems become layered across multiple agencies, departments, and funding streams, clarity often decreases at the point where accountability is most needed, at the level of outcomes. So when the final clarification comes, that roughly a quarter of spending goes to the 15 major institutions, it becomes more than just a financial statistic. It becomes a reflection of where influence, oversight, and strategic control are most concentrated within the cultural sector. And that brings the entire exchange back to its original tension: the gap between high-level political language and operational clarity. Because whether one agrees with the criticism or not, the core issue exposed in this debate is not easily dismissed. It is the growing reliance on broad, value-driven policy language without equally precise mechanisms for evaluation. And in any system that involves public trust, public money, and national institutions, that gap inevitably becomes a point of contention. What makes this exchange particularly striking is not that disagreement exists. Disagreement is expected in parliamentary scrutiny. It is that the disagreement is rooted in something more structural: the difficulty of translating modern political objectives into measurable, enforceable standards without reducing them to vague aspirations or overly rigid metrics that fail to capture complexity. And that is why the final impression of the exchange lingers. Because beneath the technical explanations and policy assurances, the fundamental question remains unresolved. If you cannot clearly define success, how do you fairly judge it?